Welcome to Unbound Voices, a CSVR podcast, and this one is looking at reparations and justice, reclaiming dignity, and repairing histories. This conversation is hosted by the Center for the Study of Violence and Reconciliation, CSVR, and for today's episode, our objective is to explore the meaning, implications, and pathways of reparations in the African and African diasporic context through an intersectional and justice-centered lens. Today's episode seeks to deepen public understanding of reparations as a multidimensional process of restoration, healing, and redress. Of course, not limited to financial compensation, but also encompassing institutional reform, historical accountability, and cultural repair. My name is Nangamso Kwinana, and I'll be moderating today's conversation. In our conversation today, we would have two speakers, and we would be looking when the African Union declared its annual theme, Reparations, Justice for Africans and People of African Descent through Reparations. This declaration marks a critical opportunity for African countries to reflect on legacies of colonialism, apartheid, slavery, dispossession, and systemic violence, and to commit to meaningful forms of redress. For South Africa, this conversation is particularly pressing. Although the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which is the TRC, created a platform for truth-telling, many communities still feel that justice and reparations were never fully realized. Structural inequalities persist, especially in land ownership, education, and access to economic opportunity. Movements such as those led by the Economic Freedom Fighters, the EFF, have reignited national debates around land expropriation, economic redress, and the moral imperative for reparations. Simultaneously, global conversations from CARICOM's Reparatory Justice Campaign to local grassroots movements in the US and also in Europe offer comparative insights and solidarity for African movements. This episode, brought to us by CSVR, aims to unpack what reparations mean in an African context, how justice can be realized beyond rhetoric, and what steps need to be taken in order to reclaim dignity and repair historical harms. As mentioned previously, in today's conversation, we are joined by two experts, and I will now welcome the ladies to please introduce themselves. Let us start with you, Annah. If you may please come in and introduce yourself. Good day.
Thank you, Nangamso. Good day, everyone. My name is Annah Moyo. I'm the Executive Director at the Center for the Study of Violence and Reconciliation.
Thank you so much, Annah. And I will now move over to our second guest. If you can please also come in and introduce yourself, Dr. Lillian Mubyeyi.
Yeah, hi, everyone. Yes, my name is Lillian Mubyeyi. I'm the co-founder and Executive Director of African Futures Lab. Thank you for inviting.
Thank you very much, ladies. I think to kick off our conversation, we could perhaps start looking at framing and defining what does reparations mean in the African context, and also looking at the African diasporic context. Worded differently, how is reparations understood in both African countries and among people of African descent living around the world?
Thank you, Nangamso, for this question. I think from the perspective of African Futures Lab, it is important to start with a legal definition that had been used for multiple years in the international legal human rights framework. And there is a definition by the UN principles and guidelines concerning the right to remedy and reparations that was proposed in 2005 and where multiple countries around the world, beyond Africa and and in many parts of the world, they have approved these principles. And this definition suggests that there are multiple forms of reparations. The first one include restitution, in the sense that it is important for victims of gross human rights violation to be put in a situation that will before the violation, the concerned violation of human rights. The other form that reparations can take is compensation, financial compensation, and that, of course, we'll think we see what it means. There is reparations can also take the form of rehabilitation. In this sense, it can be allowing the victims to have access to psychological care, legal services, but it also reparations can take the form of what is called the guarantees of modern repetition. And this means to the different reforms, legislative reforms, that the state needs to take to make sure that the violence that has occurred don't occur anymore. So from this UN definition, we see that reparations cannot be limited to financial compensation. It can take multiple forms. And if we look into the into recent history, the ways in which human rights violations have been addressed in the past years, we have used this definition to respond to the multiple violations, to do restitutions, to do compensation, to do rehabilitation, and to take different forms, legislative reforms, as a way to address the future and to make sure that human rights violations don't occur. So I would stop here, but happy to give additional elements after.
Thank you very much, Dr. Umye, for that grounding and also that foundation. I think you've definitely helped us with centering and anchoring our conversation for today. If we now look at how have African countries approached the idea of reparations since independence, guided by the very same definition and context framing that you've shared with us, please could you go ahead and share how have African countries approached the idea of reparations since independence? And how can we move beyond financial compensation to understand reparations as cultural, institutional, and psychological redress?
I think it is important to start by stating that although people tend to think that reparations is a new topic, it concerns new demands. If we look back in time, we realize that there have been multiple demands that have been expressed from the 60s, from the late 50s, by communities, by countries, and that we have to pay attention to the condition of expressing these demands for reparations and the way they have been received and the way they have been challenged. So it's not a new topic. It's something that goes back in time. And the first example that I can give is the restitution of looted cultural artifacts. We can see some of the demands expressed by African states in the 60s. And this has been showed in the report by this Felwinsa and Benedict Savoy. It's a very well-known report in these issues. The second example that we can give is the reform of the international economic order. After the independence, many countries, many African countries, were challenging or denouncing the fact that the colonial order has maintained an economic the post-colonial economic order has maintained them in a situation where they're unequal compared to other European states. So they have used the UN spaces to ask for the reform of the economic political order, by demanding what has been named as the new international economic order. But these demands, unfortunately, met resistance from other states. But this is also an example of that, where we can see, like in the 70s, countries coming together and asking for dismantling the economic order that have inherited. So we can also take another example that is not expressed by the states, but by communities. And in this case, I would like to give the example of the mixed race children that have been abducted by colonial administration in the specific case of Belgian colonial administration. One of the reports that we published last year, we show that some of the demands for justice and reparations from these children in the associations of that these children have formed, they date back to the 1917, so for 1960s. So that means that if we look closely, this is not a new topic. These are not new demands. It's demands that have been expressed for the last 70 years, and covering different topics, whether it's economic, whether it's the question of the restitution of artifacts, or whether it's this specific issue of the mixed race children.
I think you've also touched on a very important subject, that what we are discussing is not necessarily new. And I think it would be imperative to have a look at what lessons can be drawn from African countries post-conflict or post-colonial reparations efforts, and how have political actors across the continent shaped the current discourse on reparations. I think we could also go ahead and look at what global examples African countries can learn from in designing reparative justice strategies.
I mean, there are different considerations in your question. And if we look at what other examples of reparations can we see in the world, and that can serve as a source of inspiration, I would say you can have like two axes. The first axis concerns a case of reparations from Germany to Israel. After the Holocaust, we know that the Jewish people have been subjected to the genocide. They have been suffered horrible violence in the hands of the Nazi regimes. And it's important when we look at the other examples in the world where there have been reparations to look at, first of all, reparations from one state to another. And a key example here is reparations paid by Germany to Israel. As we know, the Jewish people have been subjected to genocide and have gone through horrible violences in the hands of the Nazi regimes. And in the early 50s, in 1952, the German state signed this international agreement with the state of Israel, where it recognized, first of all, the horrors of the Holocaust and apologized. And that's the first thing. And secondly, accepted to pay reparations to the state of Israel. And these reparations took the form of financial compensation of the equivalent of today $8 billion US that were paid over 14 years. this is an agreement that has been implemented. So it's not something that's theoretical, but it's something that has brought a lot of resources to the state of Israel. So that's one example that we can take. The other examples that we can take is also to look at the ways in which former slave owners countries have paid reparations to slave owners. And this is the case of UK. This is the case also of France. In the UK, for instance, after the abolition, the state decided to compensate slave owners and borrowed money. The state borrowed money to be able to pay reparations to slave owners. And the amount of money that the state borrowed was the equivalent of the 40% of the annual income of the state. So this is, I would say, a huge debt that the state contracted to be able to compensate the slave owners. And it's only in 2015 that the UK finished to pay back that debt. We have seen the same situation with France, where the slave owners were also compensated. Again, I think there's another example that we can take where in the case of Belgium, where colonial agents that were in DRC were compensated because they had lost properties, because they had lost material objects that they have, or the elements they have in the former colonies. So we can see that there are multiple examples of reparations for related to colonial crimes, whereas it's in the first case of the Germany that is paying reparations to the victims of the Holocaust and to the state of Israel, and in the second case where it's reparations that is paid, and where even the state decides to borrow money to contract debt to be able to compensate slave owners. So I think these are different examples to show that when we want to be creative in terms of imagining how reparations can be paid or the form that they can take,
we'll now maintain within the historical and political context, however, slightly observe from a South African lens, and we'll invite the executive director of the Center for the Study of Violence and Reconciliation to help us with looking at what lessons we can learn from South Africa's post-TRC efforts, and also observing the limitations regarding reparations. Secondly, we'd like to also have a look at how have political actors like the Economic Freedom Fighters, the EFF, positioned reparations within contemporary political discourse in South Africa.
Thank you, Nangamso, for these two questions. I'll start with the first question that looks at some of the lessons that we can learn from the South African post-TRC efforts and limitations regarding reparations. First and foremost, I think with South Africa's TRC process being one of the first truth and reconciliation commissions on the continent, there's a lot of lessons that we can learn from how reparations were dealt with by the TRC itself, but also in the aftermath of the process itself, particularly when it comes to the implementation of the recommendations that were made regarding reparations. The first lesson for me really is around the fact that when we talk about reparations, we are talking about repairing the damage that has been done to a society as a whole, to communities affected by this violence in their entirety, to individuals and their families that would have suffered either directly or indirectly. So with reparations, we need to look at reparations that cover the whole spectrum of the damage, the harm caused to a society, to communities, to individuals, to families. It can never be reparations for individuals who directly experienced harm, because again, harm is collective as well as individual. When we look at something that has happened within a society, such as apartheid, which was systemic. It was a system of brutalization, of dehumanization, a system of inequality. Therefore, we need to look at the impacts of this system and systemic harm to the whole spectrum of society that was subjected to this harm. So the efforts by the South African government or through the TRC to focus on individuals who came forward to give testimony during the TRC is a faulty one, because again, you are prioritizing only those individuals who came forward to give testimony about their own experiences, and then only those who came forward got recognition of their victimization and their victimhood. There were scores of people who did not come forward at the time of the TRC to give testimony, and as a result, they were excluded and were found to be ineligible for reparations. This was a faulty way of addressing reparations, particularly for a country where the majority of people were basically brutalized, victimized, and were victims of a system that was aimed at oppressing them. So the close list of about almost 22,000 people who were found to be eligible for victims was exclusionary in nature. We still have families, we still have individuals who were not able to come forward during the TRC process, but who really are genuine victims and should be eligible for reparations, and they are outside the scope of who government. And up to today, we are talking about more than 100,000 victims in the Kulumani support group, listserv, who are genuine victims of apartheid era violations, but did not come forward to give testimony during the Truth and Reconciliation Commission process, and therefore cannot access reparation. Just from the TRC recommendations up to now, it has been a fight by the South African Coalition for Transitional Justice, a coalition of organizations that monitor implementation of the South African TRC recommendations, to have the South African government reopen the list and admit as eligible victims from the Kulumani support group and other victims who did not come forward during the TRC process. But we also learn again that it's important to also prioritize socioeconomic reparations. In the South African context, of course, a lot of the violations that were acknowledged and that gave rise to reparations were violations of political nature. So your rights, your civil and political rights violations were what was prioritized. But socioeconomic violations were not really prioritized, and there were no reparations that were very specific to socioeconomic violations that occurred in the country. And 30 years later into South Africa's democracy, or 31 years later rather in South Africa now, we see the impact of not addressing the socioeconomic dimensions of harm. And it has come again and again to haunt us as a country, as we see a lot of socioeconomic challenges, socioeconomic ills that have pushed people into going into the street. Violent protests are mostly around socioeconomic challenges that people are facing, and inequality is still one of the biggest obstacles that we face, or rather, one of the biggest root causes of the current violence that we see in South Africa. And that's part of what was not addressed. As another key lesson, the need to continuously engage with victims and keep the list. It's important that we separate a reparations program from the broader truth-telling and truth-seeking process, because those are usually time-bound. But victims should be allowed to continuously come forward and record their experiences. And as they record their experiences and harm is acknowledged, they should be found eligible for reparations, something that a country like the Gambia has taken into consideration, having learned from some of the limitations we've experienced in South Africa, where now they are now having a reparations commission separate from the Truth, Reconciliation and Reparations Commission that they had between 2018 and 2022.
That is a very great way of leading us into a very important item when we are speaking about reparations. We now turn our eye to law, the land, and of course, accountability. I'll start with you, Dr. Unbiei, in asking, how do we observe the current legal frameworks? Their limitations, their possibilities for meaningful reparations, and what role must we allocate to legal reform? What role does legal reform play in making reparations possible at a large scale?
I will use the example that Annah Moyo has just presented to us to illustrate the limitations of law. As she was saying, within the South African context and the TRC, there has been a focus on human rights violations understood as civil and political rights. The whole component of the apartheid system, that was central in which regards to socioeconomic inequalities, has been addressed in a very limited way in the TRC. So this is, I would say, the first instance or a big illustrations on the ways in which law in itself is limiting if we are trying to repair these harms, these colonial crimes and historical injustices. The second point that I would like to add is that the same law that has been used to establish apartheid, to establish colonial powers, so the colonial dynamics, is international law, and it's in the context of colonial processes, and is the same law that we're trying to use to dismantle the harms, to dismantle these injustices. And in that sense, that's we are facing the limitation. It's quite paradoxical because we're trying to use the master tools to dismantle the master house. And I would like to give a concrete example coming from this the same case that I was mentioning earlier on the Métis children. So as your listeners may know, the Belgian administration has abducted children from African mothers, in this case from Burundi, DRC, and Rwanda, and because they were from European fathers and African mothers, and placed them in religious institutions. And as I was saying earlier, these children have been asking for justice and reparations for multiple decades now. And in 2021, some of them managed to sue the Belgian state in Belgium, asking for reparations. And I remember I was attending the hearings, and the Belgian state, one of these key arguments was to say this practice at that time was legal. All the different colonial administrations were practicing the same policy of removing mixed race children from their African mothers. So it was allowed at the time. So we can't consider now as crimes against humanity. So basically, that's and for me, that instance shows this paradox of going to court, trying to have justice and reparations, but at the same time being taken back to the kind of to this kind of paradox that it is the colonial instruments that allow these type of practices. So law in itself, I think it's is limiting, but I think it's also up to us to find, to be creative, to still convince some of the obstacles and that can be demonstrated as that one. And to go back to your question of like how law can be used as an instrument to in a more like open possibilities, I think it's important that we don't leave the terrain of law by saying it's only master tools. I think it's important to make sure that if we manage to have some forms of justice, that it's binding, and people, the states that commit to pay reparations, that commit to render justice, the states or the individuals, then it's not something that they can just like overnight decide to move away. So it's also something that we can continue to use and say this is a right. This is not something that is just benevolent. It's something that comes when the states want to express generosity and charity and aid. No, it's a right that is that needs to be respected to the communities.
I'll now move over to focus once again at the South Africa context. And I'll now ask Annah Moyo if you could please come in and share with us how can we meaningfully include gender in reparations efforts in a way that addresses gender disparities? And secondly, can the South African Constitution and legislative system accommodate the radical transformation needed for reparations?
That's an important question, Nangamso, and I'll start with the last question you've asked around whether the South African Constitution and legislative system can accommodate the radical transformation needed for reparations. If you look at the preamble of the South African Constitution, it's very clear that one of its aims is to correct the injustices of the past. And part of those injustices include gender injustice and gender inequality, as well as inequality as a whole. So inequality particularly aimed around race, around color, around ethnicity, etc. And those are important, and particularly for the majority of Black people. Whilst Black people as a whole were marginalized and were subjected to oppression, women in particular within that group were also even more vulnerable, particularly owing to some of the beliefs, the belief systems, some of the attitudes, the norms that existed, traditions and cultures that really led to patriarchal system, patriarchal tendencies that led to gender injustice. So with that kind of corrective justice paradigm that the South African Constitution sought to take, some of the rights embodied in the Bill of Rights in Chapter 2 of the South African Constitution, it's very clear that everyone is equal before the law and should enjoy this equality. And then it specifically highlights that no one must be discriminated on any grounds. Some of the classifications are gender, class, nationality, ethnicity, tribe, amongst others. But I want to focus on gender because this is important. So when we look now at some of the legislative measures that have been put in place, particularly around affirmative action, which really stems from Chapter 9 of the Constitution towards basically ensuring that historically disadvantaged groups, particularly women and Black people as a majority group in the country, at least try and achieve or are brought up towards achieving equality and coexisting at an equal footing with the rest of those who were previously are privileged and advantaged in the country. If you look at the Employment Equity Act, equality and equity in the workplace, if you look at some of the mechanisms that have been put in place, like the equity courts, amongst others, the South African Human Rights Commission, all of these are aimed at ensuring that equality and transformation, as enshrined in some of the provisions of the Constitution, are upheld, and that specific measures are continuously being taken, first and foremost, to ensure that equality is achieved, but also monitoring that some of what has been provided in the Constitution is upheld, and any behavior or any acts that are contrary are called out, and where some of these behaviors amount to injustice, that there is some form of redress, particularly for victims, and acknowledgement of some of those violations, either through the courts or through the commission itself making pronouncements around some of these violations and calling out either the state or any other actor who may be violating some of those rights. So we see some of this semblance of this transformative agenda towards reparation embodied within the Constitution, which then means that South Africa did not see reparations as a once-off agenda, but it saw it as a continuous agenda, an agenda that's so important that even in the Constitution, some excerpts of it needed to be embodied there. And we know every constitution in any country is the supreme law of the land, again showing the importance of this transformative agenda by its placement within the highest law of the land.
We now turn our eye and observe at collaboration and also implementation. I'll start with you, Dr. Umgei. What role do cross-sector partnerships play in designing and implementing reparations? What would you say is the role of the state, civil society, academia, and also international institutions in realizing reparations?
I would start by saying that it's it's fundamental to have this cross-sectoral collaboration among the states, civil society organizations, academia, communities, in the sense that they are bringing different angles, and we need all these different angles to make sure that reparations are holistic, in that we don't have a limited approach, or we are only looking at one angle. If we take, for instance, the role of academia, we know that there are a lot of evidence that can be brought through from the archives or economic dimensions, legal dimensions of all these historical injustices and the way they manifest today. So the role of academia in building evidence for this fight for reparations is important. The role of civil society organizations here again is very much important to the people who are directly affected or who have been victims, or the descendants who have been victims, will bring that angle, to bring that experience, because I think these are the experiences, insight that we cannot get from data, from the way to understand like the impact. Same thing for states. I think in the demands for justice and reparations, I think there are also macro structures in terms of reparations where I would say individuals and communities are not necessarily able, will not be able to. And I would like to take, for instance, the case of, if we look at climate reparations, we know that all the negotiations regarding, the climate impact and the environmental impact, all these negotiations are dealt by the states. So to make sure that the voices of the people are represented in these negotiations, it has to go through state institutions. The same thing, the same argument or the same logic applies to the regional institutions. If you look at the African Union approach to reparations, it's also to bring together these different countries And by saying like, because there are all these different countries who are much more powerful if you have to ask for justice and reparations through former colonial administration. And we can take an example of context where this collaborative approach has been missing and the consequences of that. And one example here that is interesting is the Namibian case. In 2022, the German government decided to respond to the demands that have been expressed by the Namibian state in regard to the genocide of the Ovaherero Nama communities. But the German government, the German state, has been collaborating only with the Namibian state. The Nama communities and the Ovaherero Nama communities have been excluded and sidelined from these negotiations. And I think what they have been challenging the agreement that comes out of these negotiations by saying that the outcome of these negotiations between the two states was problematic in the sense that it didn't take into consideration the voices of the communities. The German government has decided to pay 1 billion to the US to the Namibian state as a form of development aid. And this has been challenged by the communities. It has been challenged by a group of UN special rapporteurs by saying this is not reparations. So if you decide to sideline a group of people, in this case the communities who are directly concerned and affected by the crimes that you want to repair, then you are you're not taking this effort of reparation seriously, because the demands for justice that they are putting forward are not taken into the process of reparations. It is important to center the people who are directly affected, the communities, the victims are directly affected. And also, I mean, it's something that I forgot. It's something that was also missing in the efforts built by the Belgian government when they tried to address the issue of the mixed race children. In this case, they also have sidelined the voice or the demands of justice or reparations from mixed race children that were in the Great Lakes region. They have focused on some of the demands expressed by associations based in Belgium. So all this to say that there are different angles to this problem. And it is important to have this holistic approach. If we look at climate, if we look at the economic reform, these are different angles where it cannot be a limited number of actors that intervene in the designing and implementation of the power.
In a society struggling with poverty and inequality, how do we argue that reparations are not a luxury, but rather a necessity, especially considering today's climate where people feel that women have sufficiently effective empowerment structures? How do we overcome political resistance or apathy to reparative justice? And what would you say are the most common arguments against reparations and how they can be challenged?
There are multiple considerations into your question. The first one is the issue of resistance. You may know there are a lot of resistance and multiple forms of resistance. The other argument that we hear is that slavery and colonial crimes is something that concerns the past, and we have moved beyond let's build a future. We can't look at poverty if we don't deal with this history of colonial extractions and neo-colonial extractions that have maintained African populations and different countries in the situation of spaces of extraction. So it's not a separate question. It's not like we have to put the issue of dealing with poverty first and then repression. I think the issues of addressing colonial legacies is first and foremost the question to be addressed. And then after, we look how it impacts like our economic systems, environmental system, education systems, etc.
Annah, how would you argue that reparations are not a luxury but a necessity, especially observing today's climate, where some people feel that women have the sufficient and effective empowerment structures?
So in a society like ours here in South Africa, where poverty and inequality are basically the order of the day, and the majority of people within the society are literally languishing in poverty, and inequality is at its all-time high in the country. I just have a few, perhaps, recommendations on how we can literally turn the situation around. Again, these are, as Dr. Lillian highlighted, these are not current issues or current problems. They have a root cause, and they stem from our unequal past. Some of them are legacies of the unfinished business of our past, and how we repaired a society, a nation that came out of systemic oppression over a long period of time. So some of what we didn't do well in the past is coming now to haunt us. So the very reparations that we did not delve into for socioeconomic harms and violations are some of the reasons we find ourselves where we are today. And even some of the laws that were passed to try and bring about equality and to advance equity, they've also fallen short. Some of them became politicized, and a lot of them basically became susceptible to corruption. So reparations can never be a luxury for the majority of people who went through the apartheid system, who were brutalized, dehumanized, and whose rights were violated by a system that was meant to oppress them. So when we talk about addressing socioeconomic challenges within a country, when we see men and women, particularly young people, taking to the streets because of socioeconomic challenges or lack of service delivery, and most of the services that people want are basically around recognition, or rather their socioeconomic rights that accrue to them, rights that they should be enjoying, but they are not enjoying them. So we need to flip the script and really look at the government focusing on some of these and taking a reparations lens towards how do we actually ensure that equality becomes possible for the majority of people who still are still experiencing inequality. Poverty in South Africa basically has an identity, and the identity and the face of poverty is Black majority people in the country. So how do we bring in, perhaps not transitional justice, but how do we bring in reparatory programs that are aimed at addressing some of these challenges? But we need to say this is the justice that communities deserve, and we need to take a justice approach or a reparations approach to making sure that this become a reality, particularly for the majority who have not enjoyed them for the longest time. It was a promise, yes, but a promise that has failed to be delivered, that has not been delivered, particularly for the majority. So a reparations lens can really help us to bring about this transformation, to do away with some of the pre-existing vulnerabilities, the systemic issues that still continue to make justice, equality, and particularly reparations a reality, particularly for most of those who were most affected by the apartheid era system.
That's really great. Thank you so much, Annah, for your reflections. And as we are now nearing to conclude our conversation, if we observe justice and healing from both a South Africa context and also the continent of Africa at large, I'll start with you, Dr. Umnye. What role can reparations play in healing historical and intergenerational trauma? How are reparations connected to justice, dignity, and rehumanization? And how should reparations engage with gendered harms or the exploitation of marginalized groups?
Again, I think there are multiple threads in this question, so maybe I would focus on one, how the question of reparation is tied to the issue of healing and rehumanization. I would start by saying that colonialism, slavery, colonialism, and neocolonialism have not focused only on the material or material resources of Africa. It has the violence, the harm has targeted human beings, our bodies, our cultures, our knowledge, ways of seeing the world. And I think what the conversation and reparation is doing is also bringing the light onto the necessity, the need to heal ourselves in the way we see we see our body and see our culture and see our knowledge. As you may know, and I think it's also tied to, we can tie this to this issue of gender that you were mentioning, that as Black women, the way our bodies were seen by colonial administration now, still seen by, all these neo patriarchal global systems, all these perceptions of our bodies, I think many of us have also inherited that. They are still doing a lot of harm to our bodies because we have not reconciled with our bodies. And I think the same thing with our languages, the same thing with our cultures. So how this idea of reparations and repairing our reparations can also be a space where we will connect with our languages, we will reconnect with our cultures, and spaces where we also regain dignity. So I think I think if we want to make sure that the process of reparations that we're building, it's not something that is going to fall apart in a few years. This work in regard to healing, in terms of in regard to rehumanization, has to go hand in hand with this work of reparations. And another, component that I would like to add to that is the issue of the division, the way as Africans have been divided among the countries with the ethnicities that have been taken as a way to divide people. I'm coming from Rwanda, and I think we have seen a traumatic genocide coming out of this way of dividing different ethnicities. But I think this process of tribalization and ethnicization can also be seen in the context of Africa. And I think going back and seeing how we have not necessarily healed ourselves from this process of dehumanizing Africans and dividing Africans. Going back to that and doing foundational work in regard to that is a way of also building long-term sustainable process of reparations. So I see them as processes that need to be first and foremost with ourselves, in our identity, within our communities, within our countries, before or in parallel to the work that where we go outside and ask for justice and reparations. Because if this work of healing and gaining dignity and healing ourselves is not done, then all the efforts that we put in reparations can be destroyed very rapidly. Because if a country comes and divide us and use the divisions that we have among us, then we have to start again the process. So I think it's work that needs to go hand in hand.
And Anna, I could hear that you were also keen to jump in, still within the subject of justice and healing. Would you like to come in with reflections that may be zooming into the South Africa context, perhaps?
Mm-hmm. I also wanted to add on to what Dr. Lillian has said, particularly in the South African context, the apartheid system and the violations that occurred during that period did not leave communities and the entire society the same, particularly the Black majority people. So the kind of dehumanization, the kind of brutalization that system brought basically broke individuals down. It ate away at their dignity and their esteem. And the need for healing cannot be overemphasized, particularly for people who have gone through systemic brutalization like what the apartheid system did, particularly in South Africa. So justice and healing really become intertwined. We have seen in the work that we do as the Center for the Study of Violence and Reconciliation that sometimes justice, even reparations, when delivered without healing, can actually even result in more harm than good. But when healing is part of the justice needed, and is integrated into justice systems or even reparations, then this is where we see basically the transformation that's needed, particularly in the transformation of victims and perpetrators becoming active citizens who can positively contribute in the governance, democratic and other processes within a country. But without healing, victims perpetually remain as victims, and some of what they went through even impacts some of their processes, even their well-being and their existence and functioning in society. So when you look at the basic principles that Dr. Lillian spoke about, the 5 forms of reparation that are highlighted in the basic principles include rehabilitation as one of the forms of reparation, which really talks about healing, collective healing, individual healing. And this is important. And perhaps I can end with this. Some of what comes out consistently as a root cause is the unresolved trauma of the past. And this shows basically why healing is important for people who would have gone through the kind of violations and the kind of harm, psychological harm, that a system such as apartheid would have subjected them to. And the paradox is this: when it comes to healing and justice and even fighting violence or even trying to sustain the peace that we may have achieved through transitional justice and other peace-building processes, in many instances, and this is very true in South Africa, the very generation that went through apartheid in South Africa is numb or accepted the fact that this is what we went through, and they've been accepting of the process that South Africa undertook, the truth and reconciliation process, emphasizing reconciliation and coming together in forgiveness, in moving forward as a country. But we see the generation after, or who we call the born frees, they are angrier and they are more violent. And part of it explains what we talk about as intergenerational trauma. In keeping quiet, in not talking about the experiences, parents think, or the previous generation thinks, that it's sparing the current generation from the trauma or what they went through. But the truth is, trauma can be passed down through generations, just like a child who is breastfeeding from their mother literally can get sick if the mother is suffering from an ailment, and if the mother is taking medication, that medication can affect the child. So that trauma is passed down to the next generation through the silencing that we see a lot happening from the previous generation, not wanting to talk about what they went through and not wanting to go through healing processes to address some of their experiences. So the angrier generation, the much more radical generation, does not understand why they are angrier than the very people who went through the apartheid system, whose rights were violated directly. And part of it, the explanation is in the trauma that has been passed down. And that trauma now are manifesting as outbursts of anger, outbursts of frustration in the system that has not changed much from basically what was promised and what is currently playing out in society as gross human rights violations, as violence, as promises that have been made but have not been honored by the government of the day.
That's a very powerful reflection. Thank you so much, Annah. And as we now conclude our conversation, ladies, I'd like to give both of you an opportunity to share with us practical pathways that could help us with our future. Please could you reflect what might reparative justice look like in practice? And that is looking at the wider field of land redistribution, education, acknowledgement ceremonies, and of course, legal accountability. We'll start with an observation of the continent, which will be shared by you, Dr. Umke, and then we will close off with a reflection, which is going to zoom into the South Africa context.
I think it's important to bear in mind that there are multiple forms of harms, and these multiple forms of harms, whether it's individuals, whether it's against the communities or the countries, need different forms of reparations. But I will start by saying that first and foremost, I think we need what one scholar, Jason Haeckel, has called like narrative reparations. The narratives around like colonial injustices, the narrative around like the consequences of colonial injustices. These narratives have been, I think we can see the case in South Africa where they have been distorted. It's almost like, it's something that hasn't, people pretend that it's something that has those who are victims are not victims and those who are perpetrators are now like the victims. So I think in terms like rewriting history and making sure that this history is taught in school. So, and this is tied maybe to the question of the reforms of some of the system, education system is one of them, and that is very much important in this writing history. The second component that I would say is fundamental in this process of reparations is the legal accountability. We know that in many parts of Africa, colonial administrations have committed murders, tortures, disappearances against individuals and against communities. It happened with France in Cameroon. It happens with the UK with the Mama in Kenya. It happened with the Belgian administration in DRC. So there are multiple instances of this gross violation of human rights against individuals, and also there's this case of the children that have been abducted by the colonial administration, and the mothers as well as the children that have suffered with it. So there needs to be accountability on that injustice and reparations for these different instances of human rights violations. And the other form that reparations could take is the restitution of artifacts. We know that 90% of African cultural heritage is in global North institutions. So I think it's important that these cultural artifacts go back to where they belong to, and go back to Africa and don't stay. And another important component for African Futures Lab, and for me, it's also working at this macro level. We cannot focus only on individuals and communities if the state institutions are trapped in these colonial structures. And therefore, we need to look at the way to repair the climate, environmental injustices that are affecting African countries, and also the economic injustices, or the colonial economic order that has trapped Africa to be just at the bottom of this hierarchy in terms of socioeconomic development. And this, of course, I think there are practical examples that have been given by the African Union into the different declarations, saying we should reform the international financial institutions, we should ask for debt cancellations. So this also could be one of the levels at which we work on reparations. The different angles, like at the individual levels, looking at the violence that has been that has targeted specific people, then looking at the communities in terms of land dispossession, in terms of the looting of cultural artifacts, and then looking at the macro level of debt cancellation, so the reform of international financial institutions, and most importantly, look at the way the narratives around this colonial history are still distorted, and we don't address the ways in which Africa's position in the world, contemporary, is so tied to this colonial history, into this space as that we see as a space of exploitation and resource extraction. So these are the different components that I can see that could be central in imagining a process of reparations.
Many thanks, Dr. Omojeyi. And Annah, if we may please turn over to you to share with us reflections that could be centered on South Africa, still touching on the same subject of practical pathways.
Mm-hmm. In addition to some of what Dr. Lillian has highlighted, we definitely, in the South African context, we need a reframing process. For instance, some of the rights that we say we are providing, we really need to frame them within the ambit of reparations, because again, the rights agenda or the rights discourse, particularly when it comes to socioeconomic rights, we know that the government has to adhere to the bare minimum, and we see that in our society, even the bare minimum sometimes is not possible from what the government can provide. But when we begin to frame it from within a reparations agenda, then there's a demand that there should be a budget. There's a demand again that there is victimization and victimhood that should be acknowledged. And there is also the broader satisfaction of ensuring that restoration of dignity, restoration of worth, restoration basically of humanity of people who've been brutalized is at the core of the very process. Something that cannot be delayed, but something that is very urgent for us to pursue. And akin to a process that we had during the Truth and Reconciliation process, again, it's a process that then seeks to move us forward, and something that we cannot delegate to a later stage, but something that must be done in the now. Secondly, for reparative justice to be practical, it needs to be people-centered, particularly people who are most affected by the very injustices that we are trying to address. So the role of victims, the role of affected communities should be central, particularly in crafting or designing or even intimating what this reparation should look like. That's very important. When we have reparations that are crafted elsewhere or that are imported, sometimes those do not speak to the lived realities and experiences of those most affected. We talk about land redistribution. This is important, but I would like perhaps to talk about how all of this can be practicalized. So we really need to pursue these different forms of justice, because these are our realities and these are the issues that are at the core of the injustice that the majority of people still experience in South Africa. Redistributive justice, again, talking about not only access to land, but access to resources that have remained elusive for the majority of people. Access to opportunities that remain elusive, particularly for the majority. People who still remain on the periphery of society. We should also be talking about access to land. Again, we know the importance of land, particularly for Black people. I mean, land speaks basically to where you are going to bury your loved ones. It talks about issues of ownership. When you have land, you have a sense of identity and belonging and so forth. Without land, basically, some of those fall away. You don't belong, or rather, even when someone has passed away, we know we attach a lot of emphasis to ancestral land. Again, having family members buried within land that belongs to that family. So land is really critical. But again, we need to move beyond just the discussions around land expropriation without compensation and the current debates that we've been having around it. Section 25 of the Constitution has been clear, but its implementation has been lagging behind. So it's again something that we need to do. But again, when we talk about land, we are not talking about ownership of the land. We are talking about the empowerment that is needed and the resources needed to make that land productive. It's not, we've seen in Zimbabwe, for instance, where the land reform program saw people getting land, but without the capacity, without the technical expertise, without the resources to make it productive. And that is self-defeating because, again, it does not deliver the kind of emancipation that we're looking at through reparations. We are talking of transformative justice, again, going into structures and systems that continue to make inequality possible or that perpetuate it. We need this kind of transformation in society and in the lives of people, be it across lines of gender, across lines of class, across lines of ethnicity and tribe, across many other markers, identity markers, so that again, that transformation becomes sustainable. Again, there's an empowerment element that is needed. We don't want to just do away with systems, but we want to replace it with sustainable, transformative or positive systems that will really bring about issues of equality and justice for the majority. We also talk about, of course, retributive justice, very important because perpetrators need to be brought to book and justice must be seen to be done to satisfy victims. But I just want to talk about as well about restorative justice because again, restoration is important. Beyond restoration of buildings, restoration of property, restoration of dignity, restoration of worth, the recognition and acknowledgement of the fact that something was done, harms were committed, particularly by those who committed those harms. Apologies need to be given. But again, we need to ensure that this reparation delivers the kind of justice that brings about equality and a sense of dignity to all within the land, not only for some, but again doing away with some of the very structures that continue to perpetuate the kind of experiences we see in society and in communities.
Thank you to both our guests today, Dr. Lillian Umungei and Annah Moyo, for sharing your expertise and insights with us. Thank you to all who have listened to this episode. Thank you all for tuning into Unbound Voices, a series of podcasts brought to you by the Center for the Study of Violence and Reconciliation, CSVR. We hope you found the conversation transformative and necessary. We also hope those listening learned something from today's conversation. And for more lessons, please continue to join in on our next episodes, which will be announced on the social media platforms of CSVR. My name is Nangamso Kwinana, and I'm deeply honored to have moderated today's conversation. If we could please give a minute to both our guests to say their last reflections, and we will conclude. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you so much for making space for these conversations on reparations. for making space for dialogue between the South African experience and the other experiences on the continent. So yeah, thank you for the invitation and looking forward to continue.
Thank you. And again, it is a pleasure, Dr. Lillian, to share the platform with you talking about reparations. My last words, Nangamso, is basically this, that when we talk of reparations, we are not talking of aid, we are not talking of goodwill. We are talking of justice. Justice that is urgent, that cannot afford to be delayed, particularly for communities, for individuals and societies that have gone through something. So it's really important that we have these conversations, and such dialogue, such engagements are perhaps a starting point to bringing in voices and mobilizing towards collective action for reparations. Thank you.